There are people who wake up one day and realize they can no longer see the world the way they used to, not because something was added to their vision, but because something was removed. A veil, perhaps, a comfortable illusion. And in that moment of clarity, something shifts irreversibly. They don't become better than others. They don't become enlightened in some mystical, untouchable way. They simply see. And with that seeing comes a loneliness so profound, so encompassing, that no amount of company can fill it. This is not the loneliness of being alone. This is the loneliness of being awake in a world that sleeps, of speaking a language no one else remembers, of recognizing a truth that makes you a stranger, even to those you love most. Thomas Merton once wrote about the desert of the heart, that vast inner wilderness where the soul meets itself without disguise. He understood something that most spiritual teachers won't tell you up front, something that gets lost in all the talk of bliss and transcendence and unity consciousness. He understood that awakening doesn't free you from suffering. It transforms the nature of your suffering. It makes you intimate with a kind of solitude that cannot be shared, cannot be explained, and cannot be undone. Because here's the paradox nobody mentions when they're selling you courses on consciousness or weekend retreats to find yourself. The moment you truly wake up, the moment you see through the theater of it all, the roles everyone plays, the stories they tell themselves to avoid the rawness of existence, you become fundamentally alone. Not lonely in the sense of lacking connection, but alone in the sense of carrying a perspective that isolates you from the collective dream. And at first you might think this is temporary. You might think that if you just find the right community, the right teacher, the right partner who is also awakened, then this loneliness will dissolve. You search for others who see what you see. You join groups, you read books, you attend gatherings of the supposedly conscious. And sometimes, yes, you find moments of recognition, brief flashes where someone's eyes tell you they know. They've been there. They've seen behind the curtain too. But even then, even in those moments of recognition, the loneliness persists, because awakening is not a shared experience. It's ruthlessly individual. Your insights, your revelations, your dark nights of the soul, they belong to you alone. You can speak about them. You can write poetry around them. You can try to build bridges of words toward another person's understanding. But the actual territory of your awakening, that strange inner landscape you now inhabit, cannot be transmitted, cannot be fully known by another. Merton spent years in a monastery, surrounded by fellow monks who had dedicated their lives to the same pursuit, and yet he wrote endlessly about solitude, not the solitude of his cell, but the solitude of consciousness itself. The realization that even in community, even in prayer, even in love, there is a part of you that stands utterly alone before existence, a part that cannot be companioned, only witnessed by itself. This is what happens when you stop living on the surface, when you stop accepting the ready-made meanings that society offers you, when you begin to question not just your beliefs, but the very structure of believing itself, when you see that everything you were taught about success, about happiness, about who you should be and what you should want, these are just agreements, collective hypnosis, useful fictions that keep the machinery of civilization running. And once you see that, once you really see it, you can't unsee it. You can pretend, many people do, they have their awakening, their moment of clarity, and then they carefully, quietly tuck it away. They return to the agreed-upon reality. They pick up their role again. They learn to translate their insights into acceptable language, to dim their perception just enough to fit back into the world they used to know. But something has changed. There's a distance now. A subtle but permanent separation between you and the life you used to live without question. You go through the motions. You might even do them well. But there's a part of you that's always watching, always aware that you're participating in something you can no longer fully believe in. And the people around you, they sense it. They might not know what it is exactly, but they feel your difference. Your presence makes them slightly uncomfortable, though they won't say so. Because you remind them of something they're trying not to think about. Your very existence whispers that the world they're invested in, the identity they're defending, the dreams they're chasing, these might be optional, arbitrary. And that whisper is threatening, so they pull away. Not dramatically, not with malice. They just drift. Conversations become more superficial, invitations become less frequent, and you find yourself on the outside of lives you once felt centered in. Not because you changed in some negative way, but because you changed the frequency you operate on, and most people aren't interested in tuning to where you are now. This is the loneliness Merton spoke of. The loneliness of the person who has touched something real, something beyond the constructs, and must now live in a world that runs on constructs. It's like learning a new language, and then realizing everyone around you only speaks the old one. You can still communicate, yes. You can still connect, but the most important things you have to say, the deepest truths you've encountered, you must hold in silence, because there are no words for them in the shared language. And even if there were, most people aren't listening for them. I once knew someone who went through a profound awakening after a personal crisis, a dissolution of everything they thought they were, and when they came out the other side, they were lighter, freer, more at peace with the uncertainty of existence, but they were also unbearably lonely. Because everyone around them wanted the old version back, the version that worried about the right things, that got excited about the approved milestones, that played the game with conviction. This person would sit at dinners with old friends, listening to conversations about career moves and relationship drama and plans for the future, and they would feel like a ghost. Present, but not really there. Able to see everyone clearly, to feel compassion for their struggles, but unable to participate with the same intensity. Because the things that once mattered desperately to them, the things their friends were still desperately concerned with, these had revealed themselves as ultimately empty, not worthless but empty, lacking the weight they once seemed to carry, and the loneliest part was not being able to say this. Because how do you tell someone that the things they're building their life around are insubstantial, without sounding arrogant? How do you share that you've stopped believing in the future, not because you're depressed, but because you've realized that living for a future moment is just another way of avoiding the present? How do you explain that success and failure, praise and blame, gain and loss, these have started to look like the same thing from where you now stand? You can't. Or rather, you can try, but it will be misunderstood. It will sound like nihilism to those who haven't seen what you've seen. It will sound like you've given up, like you're justifying some kind of failure. So you learn to keep it to yourself. You learn to speak two languages, the public one, where you nod and agree and engage with the world on its terms, and the private one, the one you speak only to yourself, where the real insights live. Merton called this the hidden wholeness, the secret life that runs beneath the surface of your social self, and he suggested that this hiddenness is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be accepted. That spiritual awakening necessarily creates this split, this division between who you are in the marketplace and who you are in the wilderness of your own consciousness. But accepting it doesn't make it less lonely. It just makes the loneliness bearable. It transforms it from a wound into a companion. You begin to understand that this solitude is not a sign that something went wrong. It's a sign that something went right, that you've become real in a way that doesn't fit into the unreality around you, and slowly, very slowly, you start to find a strange kind of peace in this loneliness. Not because it stops being lonely, but because you stop fighting it. You stop trying to translate yourself into terms others can understand. You stop seeking validation for insights that can't be validated from the outside. You begin to trust your own seeing, even when no one else sees what you see. This is where the real work begins, not the work of awakening that might have been sudden, a moment of grace or crisis that opened everything up, but the work of living with your awakening, of finding a way to be in the world without being of it, of maintaining your connection to the deeper reality you've touched while still functioning in the surface reality where most people live. Merton spent decades figuring this out, writing, praying, sitting in silence, trying to articulate something that resisted articulation. And what he discovered, what he kept coming back to, was that the loneliness of awakening is not meant to be overcome. It's meant to be inhabited. It's the price of consciousness, the toll of seeing clearly. Because you can't have it both ways. You can't see through the illusion and still enjoy the comfort of believing in it. You can't recognize the emptiness at the center of all these pursuits, all these identities, all these stories, and still chase them with the same conviction. Something has to give, and what gives is your sense of belonging to the collective dream. But here's what they don't tell you, what you only discover by living through it. There's a deeper belonging on the other side of that loss. Not a belonging to a group or a community or a set of beliefs, but a belonging to existence itself, a sense of being held by something vast and impersonal and utterly reliable. Not God in the traditional sense, maybe, not anything you can name or define, but a ground of being that doesn't require your understanding or your belief to hold you. And when you touch that, when you begin to live from that ground rather than from the surface structures of identity and meaning, the loneliness changes quality. It becomes less painful, less like exile and more like solitude, less like isolation and more like independence. You realize you were never really connected to others through all those shared illusions anyway. You were just pretending together, agreeing to believe the same fictions. The real connection, the connection that matters, happens in a different register entirely. It happens in moments of genuine presence, in flashes of recognition that have nothing to do with agreeing on beliefs or sharing the same goals. It happens when you meet another person not as a character in their story or your story, but as pure presence meeting pure presence. And these moments are rare, that's the truth. They're rare because most people are too identified with their story to step out of it, even for a moment. They're too invested in their version of reality to meet you in the space beyond versions. And that's okay. That's not a judgment, it's just how it is. But it means that if you've awakened, if you've seen behind the curtain, you're going to spend a lot of time alone. Not physically alone, necessarily. You can be surrounded by people and still carry this essential solitude. Because the awakened part of you, the part that sees clearly, it doesn't have many conversation partners. Merton found his conversation partners in the mystics, the old ones, the ones who had walked this path before, Teresa of Avila, Meister Eckhart, the Desert Fathers, Chuang Tzu. He read them like letters from friends, recognizing in their words the same landscape he inhabited. And maybe that's what we all do, those of us who've awakened into this particular loneliness. We find our companions in books, in poetry, in the traces left by others who have stood where we stand. But even that is a kind of loneliness, because these companions are ghosts. They're voices from the past, echoes of people who are not here, cannot speak back, cannot confirm that yes, they see what you see. You're reading your own insight into their words, projecting your own experience onto their expressions. And while that brings comfort, it's still you, ultimately, alone with your understanding. And the people in your actual life, the ones who are here, who could theoretically understand, they're usually so caught up in their own experience that they can't really hear you. Or they hear you through the filter of their own beliefs, their own level of consciousness. And what you're trying to convey gets translated into something familiar, something less challenging, something that fits into their existing framework. You say one thing, they hear another. You try to point at the moon, they look at your finger. And after a while you get tired of trying. You realize that awakening cannot be transmitted through explanation. It can only be recognized by someone who has already awakened, and until they do, until they have their own moment of seeing, your words will remain just words, interesting maybe, poetic perhaps, but not actually understood. This is why so many spiritual teachers seem so alone, even when they're surrounded by students, because students are looking for something the teacher has stopped looking for. They're seeking answers, seeking peace, seeking enlightenment. And the teacher has realized that there's nothing to seek, nowhere to arrive, no one to become. But you can't teach that. You can only wait for the student to discover it themselves. Merton understood this. He wrote for an audience, yes. But his writing has the quality of someone speaking to himself, working things out in private, even as he knew others would read his words. There's a solitude in his voice, even when he's being most eloquent, most articulate. You can hear the loneliness beneath the wisdom, and maybe that's the ultimate paradox of spiritual awakening. The more clearly you see, the more alone you become. But the more alone you become, the more connected you are to everything. Because in your solitude, you're not separate from the world. You're just no longer confused about what you are. You're no longer lost in the story of being a separate self, trying to make it in a threatening world. You've seen through that story. And in seeing through it, you've become transparent to yourself. There's less of you to defend, less of you to promote, less of you to worry about. And in that transparency, that lessening of self, you become more porous to existence, more available to what is. But nobody around you knows this. They still see you as a person with a story. They still interact with the character they think you are. And you let them, because what else can you do? You play along. You answer to your name. You fulfill your roles. But there's a part of you that has stepped back from all of that, a part that watches with gentle detachment, with compassion but without identification. And that watching part, that witnessing consciousness, it is profoundly alone. Not lonely in the sense of wanting company, but alone in the sense of being singular, unique, incomparable. It's the alone of being utterly yourself, with no reference point, no comparison, no standard to measure against. This is the loneliness Merton lived with, the loneliness of being awake. And he didn't try to make it prettier than it was. He didn't sell it as some kind of achievement or attainment. He simply acknowledged it, described it, lived it. And in doing so, he left a map for others who would find themselves in that same territory. Because that's all we can do for each other, really. Leave maps, leave traces. Acknowledge that this path exists, that this loneliness is real, that if you find yourself here, you're not crazy, you're not broken, you're just awake in a way that doesn't have much company, and maybe if you're lucky, you'll meet someone else who's awake. And for a moment, you'll recognize each other, and in that recognition, the loneliness will soften, not disappear, but soften. You'll remember that you're not the only one who sees, that there are others out here, walking the same pathless path, carrying the same inexplicable knowing. But these meetings are grace. You can't count on them. You can't build your life around them. The only thing you can truly count on is your own presence, your own awareness, your own capacity to meet what is with clarity and compassion. And when you stop needing others to validate your seeing, when you stop hoping someone will finally understand, something shifts. The loneliness becomes workable. It becomes a space you can live in, move in, even find a strange kind of joy in, because you're no longer fighting it. You're no longer treating it as a problem that needs solving. You begin to see that this loneliness is the other side of freedom. That being awake means being untethered from the collective agreements that bind most people. And yes, that untethering comes at a cost. The cost is belonging in the conventional sense. The cost is being fully understood. The cost is the comfort of shared delusion. But what you gain is reality itself. Unfiltered, unmediated, raw and immediate and infinitely alive. You gain the capacity to meet life directly, without the buffer of story and belief and identity. And that direct meeting, that nakedness before existence, it's both the most beautiful and the most terrifying thing you'll ever experience. Beautiful because it's real in a way that nothing else is. Terrifying because it offers no solid ground, no permanent security, no place to rest and say, "Ah, now I've arrived, now I'm safe." Merton knew this terror. He wrote about it. The vertigo of standing before the abyss of your own being and realizing there's nothing there to hold on to. No self to defend, no story to complete. Just this moment and then another moment and then another. Each one completely fresh, completely unprecedented. And in that freshness, that newness, you are utterly alone. Because no one else is in this exact moment with you. No one else is seeing from exactly this angle, with exactly this history, exactly this constellation of awareness. Your experience is singular, utterly your own. But here's the beautiful part, the part that makes the loneliness bearable. In being completely alone, completely yourself, completely singular, you're also completely connected to everything. Because you're no longer separate. You're just existence, temporarily taking the form of a person, experiencing itself from this particular vantage point. And all the other apparently separate beings, they're the same existence, experiencing itself from different vantage points. So you're alone, yes. But you're also everything. The loneliness and the unity are the same thing, seen from different angles. Merton spent his life trying to articulate this paradox, the alone that is also together, the separation that is also unity, the loneliness that is also fullness. And he never quite captured it in words because it can't be captured in words, but he pointed at it, again and again, from different angles, using different images, different metaphors. And if you've had the awakening, if you're living with that inevitable loneliness, his words might serve as a small comfort, a reminder that this territory has been walked before, that the loneliness you feel is not a personal failing. It's a feature of consciousness itself. And maybe that's all we need, really. Not a solution to the loneliness, not a way to make it go away. Just a recognition that it's part of the package, that if you're going to be awake, you're going to be alone in ways that others cannot understand. But you're also going to be free in ways they cannot imagine, free to see what's actually here, free to respond to life without the mediation of fear and desire and story, free to love without needing anything in return, free to be without needing to become, and in that freedom there's a fullness that has nothing to do with having company, a satisfaction that has nothing to do with being understood, a peace that has nothing to do with external circumstances. It's the peace of knowing yourself as awareness rather than as a person, the peace of resting in being rather than in becoming, the peace of accepting this moment exactly as it is, without needing it to be different. And from that peace you can engage with the world, you can have relationships, pursue projects, play your roles, but you're not lost in them anymore, you're not identified with them. You know they're provisional, temporary, ultimately empty of inherent meaning. And that knowing, that clear seeing, it creates a loneliness that cannot be shared, but it also creates a freedom that cannot be taken away. So you walk through the world carrying both, the loneliness and the freedom, the isolation and the connection, the smallness of being one person and the vastness of being awareness itself. And most days, most moments, you're just living, just being here. Not particularly enlightened, not particularly awakened, just present to what is, in all its ordinary extraordinariness. But underneath that ordinary living, there's a depth that others don't see, a silence that others don't hear, a solitude that others don't feel. And that's okay. It doesn't need to be seen or heard or felt by others. It just needs to be lived, inhabited, honored. And perhaps, in the living of it, in the quiet honoring of your own seeing, you become a kind of beacon, not trying to teach anyone, not trying to awaken anyone, just being authentically what you are. And maybe, just maybe, someone else who's awake will recognize that authenticity, will see the loneliness in your eyes that mirrors their own. And for a moment, you won't be quite so alone. But even if that never happens, even if you walk this whole life without meeting another person who truly sees what you see, it's still worth it. The awakening, the clarity, the freedom, they're worth the loneliness, because you'd rather be awake and alone than asleep and surrounded. At least, that's what Merton seemed to believe. That's what his life demonstrated. A willingness to choose solitude over false connection. Silence over meaningless noise, truth over comfortable lies. And in that choice he found something he couldn't quite name, something that made the loneliness worthwhile. Not easier, but worthwhile. Maybe that's all any of us can hope for, not to overcome the loneliness of awakening, but to find it worthwhile, to discover that consciousness, for all its isolation, is still preferable to unconsciousness. That clarity, for all its coldness, is still warmer than delusion. And in the end, when your life is complete, when you've walked the whole path of being awake in a sleeping world, maybe you'll look back and see that the loneliness was a gift, not a punishment, not a problem, but a gift that kept you honest, kept you real, kept you from losing yourself in the collective dream, because that's what it does, this inevitable loneliness. It keeps you anchored in truth. It prevents you from drifting back into comfortable illusion. It reminds you constantly that you've seen something that cannot be unseen, that you know something that changes everything, and knowing that, being that, living that, it's lonely, yes, profoundly, inescapably lonely, but it's also the only way to be fully alive.